My name is Suzanne Lennon. I am an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Lethbridge. And I'm also a member of the board of directors of the Parkland Institute, and it's my real honor to be moderating this session today. It is my honor to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Lise Gotell. Lise Gotell is the Landrex Distinguished Professor in Women's and Gender Studies here at the University of Alberta. Much of her recent work concerns the legal regulation of sexual violence in a context of neoliberalism. Dr. Gotell has acted as the National Chair of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund and is currently the chair of the National Association of Women and the Law's Violence Against Women Working Group. The title of her talk this afternoon is The UCP's Penal, Populism and Violence Against Women. Please join me in welcoming Lise Gotell.
Thanks, everyone. Who can forget this photograph? If you're not from Alberta, you might not have seen it, but who can forget this photograph of the United Conservative Party MLAs and cabinet ministers and premier romping in the fountain of the Alberta legislature moments after passing a bill that effectively outed LGBTQ2S young people who joined gay-straight alliances. Here they are, they're celebrating this. And this celebratory romp in the fountain, I want to suggest, is drenched in symbolism. Because this, alongside killing the freestanding Department of the Status of Women of Alberta, signaled that anti-gender ideology would be really central to the United Conservative Party's agenda. I just finished this chapter for a Parkland book, and the chapter is about the UCP's agenda and its impact on Alberta women. I argue in this chapter that way too little attention has been paid to the significance of gender in the analysis of right-wing populism. The Jason Kenney government's record on gender has been described by some as being a war on women. And in the chapter that I just wrote, I demonstrate how anti-feminist claims were strategically deployed in an effort to align feminism with the Justin Trudeau government, which, of course, we know has become the symbolic representative of a central Canadian elite seeking to undermine, the Alberta economy and society. The character of UCP populism is like the character of populism that was developed by the Harper conservatives. It is a neoliberal form of populism. And by this I mean that the UCP has advanced anti-egalitarian measures aiming to reduce state intervention and to defend the ordinary people against the so-called corrupt elite. So in the chapter that I just wrote, I argue that the Kenney government embarked on a similar project to that occurred under the Harper Conservatives when they were first elected in 2006. This involved delegitimizing feminist claims making on the state and making systemic gendered inequalities disappear. And today I want to talk about how the UCP made the systemic problems of gender-based violence and gendered colonial violence disappear. That's really the focus of the talk. But in order to understand this, it's important for us to understand that part of the way that this occurred was through an all-out attack on the gender-based policy machinery within the Alberta government. So, as I mentioned, one of the Kenney government's first acts was to dismantle the freestanding Department Status of Women Alberta. It was combined with citizenship and multiculturalism, and that combined department was hit with a 33% budget cut in the Kenney government's first budget. And what that effectively meant was that the Status of Women group and their policy staffers in particular were shrunk, like they were shrunken radically. And combining status of women with citizenship and multiculturalism also meant that status of women was deprived of a dedicated seat around the cabinet table. And that's important from the perspective of public policy. At the same time, feminist experts, doctors and lawyers and professors were singled out for misogynist attacks by the Kenney government, sometimes even on the floor of the legislature. The Kenney government also sought to purge the gender-based analysis from the policy process. So you might remember how in 2020, Kenney criticized the Trudeau government's throne speech for its use of the concept intersectionality. He called it a kooky academic theory that came from a fantasy land built by Laurentian elites. GBA Plus is a tool, it's a policy tool, Gender-Based Analysis Plus is a policy tool for introducing an analysis of intersectionality in the policy process, understanding the gendered, racialized effects of public policy. And staffers in Alberta's Status of Women had made great strides in training public servants in Alberta in this method of policy analysis. They'd trained something like 1,500 policymakers and public servants in the Alberta government in GBA+. And in 2019, that project was effectively stopped, and staffers in Status of Women were told that they should no longer use the word intersectionality in policy briefs and documents. The Minister of Citizenship, Multiculturalism and Status of Women, who was Leila Ahir, told staffers that the use of the word intersectionality was making people in the government uncomfortable. The erosion of this gender-based policy machinery was really important because it served an instrumental goal for the government, for a government so deeply committed to neoliberal governance, because such moves help to make systemic gendered inequality disappear. So what I want to do is walk you through how this happened with the complex problems, social problems of gender-based violence and gendered colonial violence. As we all know, gender-based violence is a complex systemic problem that disproportionately affects women. We need frameworks for understanding gender-based violence that are gender inclusive. So we need to understand that gender-based violence can happen to men. Our frameworks need to acknowledge that gender-based violence is a problem that it really badly affects people who are non-binary and trans. But at the same time is a gendered social problem. And by this I mean that we need to understand gender-based violence as a gendered expression of domination, one that is rooted in power disparities between men and women, in dominant norms of heterosexuality, and also in hegemonic forms of masculinity. And Alberta has some of the worst rates of gender-based violence in the country. It's a problem that reverberates through our communities. In 2009, the Federal Department of Justice estimated that the costs of gender-based violence nationally are somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 billion per year. This is a deep problem, right? It's a social problem. It's a political problem. In a structural context of ongoing colonization and racism, Indigenous women are targeted, I should say, for violent victimization and sexual violence at rates that are many times higher than for other Canadian women. Indigenous feminist scholars have emphasized how gendered colonial violence functions as a tool of settler colonialism. It's not merely a form of patriarchal control. Colonial relationships are gendered and they are sexualized. As the Missing and Murdered Women's and Girls Inquiry found, Alberta is really at the epicenter of the national tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The inquiry also found that the man camps that characterize the oil and gas industries are very highly correlated with astronomical rates of violence against Indigenous women in this province. Since 2015, Women's Shelters Canada brought together a coalition of feminist groups to develop a national action plan on violence against women. And they developed something called a roadmap towards a national action plan on violence against women. And they've had some success in convincing the Trudeau government to sign on to this plan. The idea of the National Action Plan is that it is a coordinated federal, provincial, territorial plan. And the recommendations in the roadmap are about a social interventionist approach to gender-based violence, right? So the National Action Plan is specifically taking an anti-carceral approach. It's not treating this problem as a problem of the criminal justice system. Instead, it is advancing a social interventionist approach. And likewise, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls has issued calls to action to the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. And these calls to action involve sweeping structural reforms to the healthcare, child welfare, and policing and justice systems. So the idea here is that these are complex social problems. And both the National Action Plan and the final report of the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry have issued calls to action to the government of Alberta. But not surprisingly, the UCP have largely ignored the comprehensive policy strategies laid out in these two reports. Instead, gender-based violence and gender colonial violence have been squeezed into a narrow crime control framework. So what is penal populism? Penal populism is a get tough on crime form of populism through which political actors seek support. And the UCP have made extensive use of penal populism as a strategy. So think about the UCP's Rural Crime Initiative, for example, or the proposed Alberta Provincial Police Force, right? These are penal populist initiatives. Law and order policies bolster a government's image as being strong and decisive against weak and feminized opponents. Criminalization strategies also transform systemic social problems like gender-based violence and gendered colonial violence into individual problems that can be managed through the criminal justice system. So this approach, one that seeks to contain problems like gender-based violence within a really narrow frame emphasizing individual criminal responsibility, is exemplified by Clare's Law. And Clare's Law has really been held up as being the centerpiece of the UCP's initiatives on what it calls family violence, because the problem of gender-based violence is decisively degendered in UCP discourse. Clare's Law was proclaimed in 2021, and it aims to prevent the perpetration of violence between intimate partners through the sharing of information about prior histories of abuse. Clare's Law offers a degendered and individualized approach, again, to a systemic social problem. When it was passed with much fanfare in 2019, Kenney almost seemed to trip over himself not to use the word woman or women. Instead, he said the law was meant to keep vulnerable Albertans safer. So Clare's Law is really heavily reliant on the neoliberal technique of responsibilization. This process involves making a claim application to the police. And it's something that members of marginalized and racialized communities might be justifiably unwilling to do, to go to the police to make an application. You go to the police if you're afraid that your partner has a prior history of abuse, or oftentimes because you are experiencing abuse from your partner. This is a technique that makes women as potential victims responsible for preventing intimate partner violence by appropriately evaluating their own risk and by seeking information on their partners. And in this way, what happens is it shifts responsibility for preventing intimate partner violence away from perpetrators And it also obfuscates, it hides social responsibility for this problem as well. And in turn, it opens up new ways of victim blaming. Women who fail to seek information about their partners can be blamed. Why didn't you just ask? And those who fail to leave abusers when they obtain information under the law can be held responsible. So why didn't you just leave? An individualized focus on women as risk managers really ignores the obstacles that women face in leaving an abusive partner, as well as how this is often a trigger for more intense abuse. The UCP has failed to invest in necessary social supports for women seeking to escape violence, most importantly through funding women's shelters and second stage shelters, and by funding affordable housing. So penal populism really has a disdain for expert. It's not about achieving measurable results, these initiatives. Instead, it's about the symbolism. It's about passing laws, focusing on criminal justice responses, and showing that you're tough on crime. What's important is the message rather than the results. The impact of Clare's law has been very marginal. Because of the obstacles in making applications, very, very few people have come forward to make applications under the law. There have been only 440 up until this past summer, when we know that tens of thousands of women and children in Alberta experience a domestic abuse. And really on brand for the UCP, the government also failed to properly invest in the implementation of this law. So if you made an application under it, you were waiting up to 3 months to get a response. And so even as a very limited preventative measure on its own terms, the law was quite unsuccessful. Gender-based violence has also been managed through performative announcements and a government by panel approach that has really characterized this government's entire agenda. So we can see this in how the government has sought to manage the very deep and pervasive problem of violence against Indigenous women in Alberta. After a lengthy process that was led by Indigenous experts, with hearings that were held in Alberta, the National Inquiry issued a transformative set of recommendations. These recommendations were aimed at addressing the gendered effects of intergenerational trauma as manifested in poverty, inadequate housing, healthcare, and barriers to education and cultural supports. And the National Inquiry was demanding action from governments. And instead, what did the UCP government do? It established a panel, a joint panel working group of MLAs and Indigenous leaders. And that working group took almost 2 years to issue a report. It was simply a delay tactic. And the recommendations made by the working group covered much of the same ground as the National Inquiry. And to date, very little in concrete action has arisen out of that report. The government established a Premier's Council to guide the implementation of the recommendations. And that Premier's Council includes many Indigenous women leaders, and they're precisely the same people who should be holding the government account on gender-based colonial violence. So, there's a real danger of co-optation. This is a great quote by an Indigenous woman leader. She said, "It's great to have ceremony and pomp, but what we really need is action and a budget line." So through these kind of performative announcements and through working groups and panels that just simply delay things, the government has really succeeded in not doing much on this file. And this is a crisis. We have a crisis of gender-based colonial violence in Alberta. And meanwhile, critical programs that were actually helping to address the crisis of missing and murdered women and girls in Alberta have fallen victim to UCP cuts. And this is one important program that was cut by the government through a funding cut. It was called SNUG. It was a highly effective program providing support for Indigenous girls here in Edmonton who work in the sex trade. And this was one of the very first cuts made by the Kenney government. It's quite likely that it fell victim to cuts because it conflicted with the government's social conservative commitments and ideology, because this program took a harm reduction approach. Alberta women's shelters and sexual assault centers on the front lines of the struggle against gender-based violence have faced incredible resource constraints in the context of the pandemic, especially more generally, but in the context of the pandemic. People talked about the problem of gender-based violence in the pandemic as being a shadow pandemic. It escalated because of the isolation we were all suffering, and it also inhibited people for reaching out for support in the context of the pandemic. The UCP has really failed to meaningfully invest in the frontline organizations like shelters and rape crisis and sexual assault centers that are really managing this problem of gender-based violence. Just to give you some picture of how bad this is, the waiting list currently at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, if you call and you've been sexually assaulted and you need counseling, you're going to have to wait 12 to 14 months for counseling. Alberta, Jan Reimer, I did an interview with her recently, and she talked about how shelters are still turning away thousands of Alberta women and children every year. The government even raided the Victims of Crime Fund in order to backfill cuts to its justice budget. Victim of Crimes Fund is a fund that was built through surcharges on people who were criminally convicted. And it had built up a really large surplus of something like $64 million because it was mired in bureaucracy. And that fund is supposed to support people who've experienced crime and their families. It's also supposed to fund supports for so-called victims, like court-based victim supports, like our network of shelters and sexual assault centers in Alberta and advocacy groups. And what the government did was it saw that this fund had a huge surplus, and it raided it to fund so-called public safety initiatives. It raided this fund to enhance budgets for rural police and also to hire more Crown prosecutors. At the same time, again, as frontline organizations who are managing this crisis in this province are so underfunded. Like Jan Reimer was talking about how workers at shelters haven't had a raise for something like 8 years. I'll conclude there, but I do have some thoughts that are more hopeful. But I know that my co-panelists are going to be talking about resistance. But I have some thoughts on that too, and how we might do that. We might create coalitions that can help us to build resistance cross-sectorally across our different social movements. But I really want the problem of gender and misogyny and gender-based violence and gender colonial violence to be part of these coalitional struggles. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lise. Our next two speakers I am happy to introduce is, the first is Bo Masterson, who is the Executive Director of the Women's Centre of Calgary. She holds an MSc in International Development and has over 15 years of international and community development experience. Bo moved to Alberta in 2014 and has since followed her passions of community building and creating welcoming communities and social connections for everyone, especially women. And also, I have the pleasure of introducing Michelle James, who is the public policy specialist with the Women's Centre of Calgary. She holds an MPH with specialization in social policy and is a health and social equity enthusiast. Michelle has worked in the social services sector in both BC and Alberta for over 10 years. And the title of their presentation today is Community, a Remedy for an Increasingly Polarized Society. Welcome to you both.
We are presenting today a unique organizational approach for preventing the rising misogyny and polarization in our society, which is contributing to the conference theme. It's important to note that, of course, this is one tool in the toolbox, and it's a methodology or a value system on which the Women's Centre in particular is based. We'll share a little bit about the Women's Centre in the context of this conference and our unique approach to being hopefully a bit of a remedy towards this rising polarization, our grounding principles which contribute to that, our unique community capacity building model, and then hopefully a case study to kind of weave through some of those theoretical concepts and then some interactions along the way. Just a really quick overview of the Women's Centres. Our mission is to be every woman's place for support, community, and connection. And our vision is really about women supporting communities and communities supporting women. So our vision is to be together in community, to experience the ups and downs, to give, to take, and to kind of work together towards that change towards gender equity. We see upwards of 10,000 women, unique individuals per year in our community. We have around 400 volunteers and 18 staff, and have a wide array of programming grounded in the principles that we will kind of go through. But we ground ourselves in the fact that women are strong and capable, and that everybody has something to bring to the table. And so our community is really about the give and the take.
Okay, so around the time that our organization was founded, a study was published called Civil Society in the New Millennium, and the authors, I've just popped it up. And really, it was a participatory research study that our founder at the time saw great value in. And basically, the study saw input from about 10,000 citizens across 47 countries, and really sought to understand what those folks thought was a good society. And the results of that study highlighted three main areas, which were the main themes that came to light. And those were basic needs, economic security, infrastructure, safety, education, those types of basic needs being met for folks, association, family and social networks, collective identity and purpose, and also a shared understanding of culture and heritage, as well as participation. So equal rights and justice, and participation in governance. So those were the kind of the themes that this study brought to light around what folks were saying what a good society was. And at the time that this was published, the authors noted, and I thought was interesting, that democracies are losing voters and citizens are missing from governance. And I think that's really well fits within the theme of this conference. And so I just wanted to bring that to light.
We kind of made a table so you can see the translation, and I just want to put this in the context of, the study was done in 2002. Although our principles and kind of areas of work stay the same, are the way that we implement those values and the way that our organization has evolved has really moved with the time, and we're working very hard to ensure that the way our organization evolves takes into account actually a lot of things that we talked about today. So our three areas of work are also our get assistance, and we really work to create a space where women can come and get basic needs supports, referrals. That's anything from emergency food hampers to menstruation products, personal hygiene products. We have free computers, internet printing, fax, phone to use for women, as well as clinics that support women in specific services around legal services, tax clinics, ID clinics, that kind of thing. Our second area of work is called Connect with Others. It's related to that association, and it's about creating that welcoming space of belonging. So our center can be described as your grandmother's living room. That is how it feels, and we should have put a picture up maybe, but it's much less clinical than you might imagine. So it's got lots of nice couches, color, and there's representations from lots of different intersectionalities and lived experiences that that women might find. We have a girls program that's focused on activism and leadership, as well as a huge diversity of workshops and events that really provide an opportunity for women to connect on similar issues or activities that kind of brings people together and makes it easy to have those conversations. Our third area of work is called Work for Change, and that's really where we get into the action. So the Women's Centre, as per kind of this study, but also what we believe in, is we want to move people from having conversations to actually actioning things, and not necessarily relying on other people to action those, but creating pathways for people. Somebody said in another session, breaking down the door and creating that pathway, and that's really I think, the strength of the Women's Centre and the way that we do our work. So we have lots of issues discussions, but we also have conversations that are uncomfortable, and we try to host conversations that don't just speak to the truth. We don't do, but we host conversations that are difficult and where we encourage people to share and be in that discomfort and move to a place of, well, what does this mean for me now that I know the truth? So those are our 3 areas of work. The model, or the original study, was really based on a stacking model where it's kind of like, if your basic needs are not met, it's hard to connect with others, and then it's even harder to become an active citizen and contributor to society. So in our little microcosm of the Women's Centre, we try to create those opportunities and interconnect those 3 areas of work.
Okay, I'm going to invite you now to either close your eyes or keep them open, but imagine that you need to borrow a cup of sugar from your neighbor. So you're knocking on the door, and your neighbor comes and answers the door, and then they ask you to fill out a form. On that form, you need to explain why you need the sugar, and then you need to provide proof of why you need that sugar. If all of that was required just to get a cup of sugar, would you go back to that neighbor in the future? What kind of relationship are you developing with that neighbor? How do you feel about that neighbor? So that kind of guides you through kind of what a typical kind of charitable program might present for folks who are in need of especially basic needs assistance. And so now I'm just wondering if you can envision a different storyline. What kind of relationships do you already have with your neighbors, or maybe another supportive or healthy relationship in your life? I personally have a neighbor, and if I need to borrow sugar from that person, I can do that. But if they need to have a chat with me in the afternoon over a cup of coffee, over something completely unrelated, we can do that too. And sometimes she may need, my printer, for example. So it's a really give and take reciprocal relationship that we have. That is the type of approach that we take at the Women's Centre. A woman can get support, and they can also give support. And we're also, at the Women's Centre, not really tied to any one role. We all play different and multiple roles within the community.
I'll just walk you through really briefly some of the theories that we ground ourselves in. One of them is feminist theory, although over the years that obviously has progressed into what we at the Women's Centre would call intersectional feminist theory. Originally in the idea that all women have experienced some form of marginalization in their life, and that does not get recognized a lot, really, in our society, in our structures, and the way that our structures are set up. That feminist kind of theory that we ground ourselves in is that we've all been marginalized in some way, shape, or form. Now, the layer on top is those marginalizations look different and more drastic depending on our lived experiences and the intersections with which we present. The second one is a structural approach, which is actually originally a social work theory. But it's really grounded in the fact that the way that people interact with the system is kind of already assuming that the woman or the people are not capable of interacting with it. So for the Women's Centre and the way that we do our work, we really look at supporting women and their immediate needs, but also really looking at those structures and how we are contributing to that public policy debate and the way that those structures make decisions. So the way that a lot of our systems are designed is by the prominent white supremacist way of thinking. And we're really trying to bring differing voices to that and saying, what does, the GBA plus method of thinking look like? What does it look like if we were to apply different intersections and different experiences to the public policy debate? The third one is the capabilities approach, which is really all about recognizing and celebrating women's assets and strengths. We are not kind of your traditional charitable model of you can come to us and then magically you will be fixed. It's you can come to us and join our community, make friends, build networks, support other women, and also be supported. Our 3 kind of promising practices, we call it promising practices because we have experienced them in our center and in the way that we've implemented our community work. Michelle touched briefly upon reciprocity. So although we have our 3 areas of work, and one of them is get assistance, and another one is work for change and connect with others, most women who are in our community work or do something in multiple areas. So it's not like, oh, you're a woman who gets basic basic needs, and then there's another woman who contributes to our policy conversations. We work very hard to create pathways for women to contribute and to receive in all those 3 areas of work. The second one is inclusion. Some of the stuff you mentioned in the last session was so relevant to this conversation because we've been having lots of debates about what inclusion looks like at our center. In the earlier waves of feminism, which were very important to where we are today, but there was this kind of assumption that, well, we're all women, we're all in this space, so we're inclusive and safe and there's a sense of belonging. But what we know now is that that's actually obviously not true. And so in our center, we call it kind of working on active diversity and inclusion, and that means we have regular reflective processes and regular thinking about what it actually means to be inclusive, and we talk with women in our center about what that looks like. We're certainly not perfect, but it is part of our kind of ongoing practice. The third one is a trust-based system. So Michelle touched on this too. It's really about, we don't do intakes. All of our programs are, you come in, we believe women are the experts of their own lives. We believe that we know what we need. And so there's no intakes, there's no proof, you don't need to prove anything. If you come in and say, I need pads, that's what you need on that day. If you come in and say, I just want to connect with someone, that's what happens on that day. So you can stay as long or as short as you want in the center.
Although Bo is doing a fabulous job, I find that it's difficult to communicate the impacts of our approach through a PowerPoint presentation. We often hear that only through multiple visits and participation in our community that folks really do begin to understand the power of our organization, both in its little local context and its potential to contribute to wider societal change. I'm going to introduce a case study. I think it's important to note that this isn't one woman's experience. However, it's kind of an amalgam of some typical experiences that we've seen at the Women's Center in the last maybe 6 months. So I'm going to introduce a woman named Oksana. Her husband and her 2 children came to Canada about 4 months ago as refugees from Ukraine. The Canadian government gave them a one-time payment of $6,000 to help rebuild their lives. But at the time of Oksana coming to the Women's Center, pretty much all of that money had been used on, a down payment, rent, other living expenses. $6,000 isn't really a ton of money, and what we're currently living through is an affordability crisis. Her spouse is unable to work because his work permit hasn't been processed. And Oksana is home with her children, and they're under 5, so she is unable to look for work as well. The cost of childcare would probably outweigh whatever wage she would be able to get. Oksana and her 2 children came to the Women's Center. They originally came to apply for an emergency food hamper and maybe get some winter jackets and gloves. When we welcomed them, she did say or conveyed that she spoke little English. What we were able to do at the Women's Center was to connect her with a peer support volunteer who recognized the language that she was speaking and connect her with another volunteer who did speak the same language. So together, that volunteer, who we'll name as Natalia, and the other peer support worker helped Oksana, and Oksana was able to confide that she felt quite lonely. She's in a new place, she doesn't speak the language very well, and she was so happy to meet someone that could actually just understand her and that she could talk to. She also repeatedly conveyed that she'd wished to learn more English. We were able to connect her with the food bank referral, an emergency food hamper, those winter jackets that she needed, and then we were also able to connect Oksana with a well-established program that we have running that helped her learn some conversational English. And in that program, there were quite a few other women from Ukraine who she was able to connect with and build a bit of a social community around. Those women would chat, have coffee after the class. There's childcare available, so Oksana was actually able to bring her kids and be able to learn English and also not have to worry about child minding. This is a true quote. I've not made this up, but one woman did actually say to us after an English class, "You have given me hope today, and I can't wait to come. When can I start?" So that was kind of Oksana's first foray into what the Women's Center had to offer. But after she'd been coming for a few more months and she'd been getting more comfortable with speaking English, she felt more comfortable joining us in some of our social issues workshops that we put on. Particular one that she joined us in was a workshop on the barriers that women face going into the workforce. And at that workshop, Oksana connected with other women who are interested in taking action on other social issues. In particular, she met a housing advocate who was able to listen to Oksana's struggles with her landlord and also her unaffordable rental costs. And with Oksana's permission, she actually shared that story with a local elected official in order to support improved housing affordability and renters' rights, particularly for women who might be experiencing multiple barriers and intersectioning social identities. This housing advocate was then also able to share with Oksana some resources that Oksana could use to help her advocate for her own rights as a tenant. Luckily, our friend Natalia, the peer support volunteer, was also able to support Oksana in navigating those resources and also reducing the language barriers that came with those. But I would like you now to reflect on that story that we just shared with you and then think about our broader societal context. And the question is, what can you observe about the Women's Center's approach and how that impacted Oksana's story and outcome? So that's the first question I'll ask you to reflect on.
Addresses the whole person. Community building makes a difference. It allowed her to feel a part of something bigger, deals with immediate short-term needs while also engaging and fostering community, cumulative confidence building, matched her needs, so a client-based approach. Listen and support her with what she needs, begins with acceptance, recognized her as an expert. Empowering, feminist community building, various assistance, which leads to her connecting, socialization, networking, creates resilient structures, building blocks to a collaborative community, inviting people in to address social issues. Instead of her just giving food and winter clothes, they devoted time to her gain experience and speak English. We were thinking a lot about how our work at the Women's Center, or how this community, let's take it even away from the Women's Center and look at kind of that community building. And I feel like, Jillery, you touched a lot on that too, that building of bridges. When we look at our polarized society, what are the things in the experience that Oksana was able to have, or in just the building of community, that translates to addressing that wider spread misogyny and polarization? Strength and resilience through community and mutual support. Didn't have to face her struggles alone. Sense of security, confidence in a community to support her. Confidence in being able to contribute to society. Social trust. Confidence in allies, having a person to talk to, no expectations. It wasn't men she spoke with, but women she could identify with. Sense of security, confidence in a community to support her. Everyone has value, yes. So to close, really what's important to us and why we presented today, or perhaps why we were asked to present, I think, is really because as we have this growing polarization, as we have this more far-right sentiment, this kind of approach, or maybe just the call to you and to community, is to have more conversations that bring people together, to create the bridges. And I want to pull actually on Willie Ermine, who is an Indigenous thought leader, who conceptualized the idea of ethical space. And without going into a very long talk about ethical space, what's really important about that concept is that it recognizes that that people come from different worldviews, from different places, from different lived experiences, but we should be inviting ourselves in, or putting ourselves into a space with people with different worldviews in a way that actually has kind of an electrifying energy, because it is nerve-wracking. There is fear, there's all these things. But if we don't step into that space, and we talked last session about brave space, then we can never move forward into reconciliation, into building that more democratic society together. So the invitation is really to come together as community rather than to enhance the polarization by stepping away.
Thank you. If you ever want to reach out, feel free to. Those are our email addresses, our social media.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Bo, and also to Lise. I think that was a really generative panel, and I think there's so many connections between the kind of the meta political that you provided, Lise, and the on the ground. We would really love to open this up for discussion.
I have a question for Dr. Gotell about the penal approach to gender-based violence. Some people may be aware that in Calgary right now we're going through a situation where a city councillor, Sean Chu, is having all these accusations that he sexually assaulted a minor many years ago now when he was a Calgary police officer. So to me, this penal approach almost allows men to keep control of mediating what is a valid complaint and what is not, because all his police buddies covered up for him. To me, the lack of other approaches to gender-based violence and this funneling of women to to the police. And the Globe and Mail also a couple of years ago had a series called Unfounded, where they found that the police were systematically dismissing these. To me, it says that this is a real failure of public policy. So I don't know if you could respond to that or offer some thoughts.
You know, I've long been critical of criminalization responses, but at the same time, I still think we need to continue to work to make the criminal legal system a better place for survivors of gender-based violence. I just talked to one the other day who was talking about the investigation of the 2003 World Junior team in Halifax and the allegations of gang rape. And he wanted to know if it was unusual for there to be an investigation launched and no update after 4 months. And I'm like, that's absolutely perfectly normal. I mean, police fail survivors of gender-based violence every day, and they fail survivors of gendered colonial violence even worse. Many of my colleagues have really sort of abandoned criminal law and are turning towards, community-based justice, transformative justice. And I think we really, really need to work on alternative justice approaches. At the same time, at this point, it's utopian to think that we can completely abandon criminal law. But this is a social problem, and we need social investment. One connection between our presentations is affordable housing, which a point you ended on. Affordable housing as an issue is a pivotal issue for people fleeing intimate partner violence. It's an anti-poverty issue. It's an anti-racism issue. It's an indigenous issue. It's a labor issue. We could make a really great coalition around the issue of affordable housing that, from my perspective, would also keep the issue of gender, or the social problem of gender-based violence, in view. That's what I mean by, at the end when I was talking about a coalitional approach to, our contemporary problems in Alberta.
My question is for Bo and Michelle, and thank you for kind of putting some of the things that we talked about in our last session into practice for us, or for us to actually see what it might look like. I'm wondering how, or if you have some best practices for having what I imagine are some challenging discussions around the evolution or the way that we're talking about gender differently with communities that maybe are coming into spaces with a background that they haven't historically talked about gender in this way. There might be cultural or religious biases. How do you navigate that and keep it safe and brave for everybody?
We're navigating that, and especially through our different layers of leadership, because people have different experiences but also different levels of interaction. But one of the things that we're really moving towards, and that has been successful in the past and continue to do, is to look more at actually more Indigenous ways of knowing and doing. And so using something like sharing circles allows every person to have space to share, but not with the judgment or the immediate reaction of somebody else, and it gives space for people to really think and reflect. So that's a very practical tool, but otherwise, it's also really important for us to look to other organizations to see what they're doing and to get some experts. So we are having, specifically on the gender conversation around gender diversity, we're having conversations with members of the queer community. We're talking with gender diverse folks about their experiences at the Women's Centre. Again, have that conversation of what inclusivity looks like, but it is certainly a really tough topic and very hot right now. And we are navigating exactly what you're saying. There are women who come to the Women's Centre specifically because it is a very gendered space. And so what does safety and belonging look like for every woman? And is it even possible for our centre to be a safe place of belonging for every woman or for gender diverse folks? So
you mentioned the cuts to the status of women's department. What kind of practical impact did these cuts have on the Women's Centre in Calgary?
My experience and my colleagues' experience is the staff working in status of women really work hard to, speak cross-ministerially and kind of advocate for, a GBA, as Lise was saying, a GBA plus approach, and really making sure that, voices of women are heard in different policy conversations. And so it was really disheartening to kind of not even know for a moment there, even if there were staff in status of women. And now we know, they're still in the Ministry of Culture, I believe.
For now.
For now, yeah. And so as the Women's Center, we're having to navigate new relationships and to kind of almost walk with those folks as they also navigate new roles. So, we're not funded by the status, we weren't and aren't funded by the provincial status of women ministry. And so, in that regard, there wasn't a big funding cut or anything like that, but it was certainly a recognition that we're gonna have to, do some real big work, advancing some advocacy that we had thought maybe was here and now has been pushed back to here. So
I will say too, back to kind of that building bridges and ethical space, is that it is our intention to work with all who are in government, because we feel like it's our role and we'd be doing a disservice if we didn't. We work really hard to build those relationships and to bring women's voices along in presenting those ideals and those recommendations to the policy debate.
Lise, you had some ideas on things we could do, and you got to one of them on a question that came earlier. Do you have a top 3?
I think a really powerful coalition around affordable housing that would really center a feminist approach. I don't think we've done a very good job in this province at building those coalitions, and we have to get a lot better. Some people say, well, maybe the left should be responding with populism to right-wing populism. But I think populism is dangerous, right? I'm not going to advocate a left-wing populism as a response to what we're facing. I do think we need to come together and form coalitions. And it does seem to me right now that housing could be one such issue. Just on the housing issue, the federal government just gave the provinces, including Alberta, some funding for affordable housing, and 25% is supposed to be targeted at women. We don't have any idea what the government of Alberta is doing with those funds. So I think housing is a really good issue to build a coalition around at this moment.
Michelle, I loved your example of the sugar and the paperwork, and one of the reasons that organizations ask for the paperwork before they give the sugar is because they have per-person funding, they have outcome-based reporting requirements, and on and on and on. How you handle that, to what extent you encounter that, how do you try and sort of manage your way around some of those practical day-to-day challenges?
We do face that. We also are really incredibly lucky, and I think that is based on kind of the way we've set up our community, that we have many women who've experienced our Women's Center or experienced our community who now give back. So we have a very strong base of people in our community who support the Women's Center. It's not that we don't collect any data, but we're really careful about what we collect and what we really need to collect. So for example, we don't do an ongoing kind of survey data collection. We do it once a year, every October, and every woman knows that if you come to the center in October, we'll ask you to fill it in, but we keep it really tight in the year so that for the most part, women are not asked to do that, but we do get the data through those kind of shorter term specific interventions. Honestly, it's a huge challenge, but I feel proud that at the Women's Center we've managed to advocate and be part of that solution to push back and have those conversations with funders. And I think it takes some bravery to do that, and courage to say, hey, let's actually talk about what you really need and what we can bring and whether we can partner together in this funding.
And of course, project-based funding is a mechanism of control, and what feminist organizations need is operational funding, right?
Yes, we do. Thank you very much, Lise.
Please join me in warmly thanking Lise, Michelle, and Bo for this generous session.